There once was a king named Ed, who traded me some of his lead. I knocked at his door, he said nevermore, and now the poor king is dead. Hey guys, James here again, and today I want to finally give my full review on Humankind, the new historical 4X game developed by Amplitude Studios, the studio behind other 4X games like Endless Legend and Endless Space. Apologies for not getting to this review sooner, but I really wanted to make sure to get some considerable hours into the game first, since I feel like you can barely understand the mechanics, let alone review 4X games with only like 3 campaigns. Even then, I'm sure there's tons I don't fully understand yet. In Humankind, you start as a small Neolithic tribe and slowly develop your empire as you attempt to answer the question, how far will you push humankind? If I had to compare this game to other games, the most obvious comparison would be the Civilization franchise, although Amplitude tries their best to make a bunch of mechanics work differently. Given the similarities though, I will naturally be comparing the games a bit throughout this review. There is a ton to discuss in this review, so without further ado, let's dive into this. Before the game. So before I even dive into the actual game mechanics, I want to start off with a quick discussion on personas, who are the leaders who run the empires in the game. One of the first things you can do is create your own persona who represents you, and maybe it's just me, but I had trouble making the persona look remotely normal. Or maybe I'm just ugly. You can also set tendencies and bonuses for the AI version of your persona. So for example, you can make your persona focus more on generating money and to prefer peaceful playstyles. What's cool is you can make your persona available on Amplitude's website for others to download and play against. As cool as that is though, I kind of wish they had done more with this. By default, they give you an okay amount of different personas to face off against, again, each with their own tendencies and playstyles. However, I feel like it would have been really cool if they allowed you to create more than just one persona. Why not let us create and share a bunch of different ones who might reflect our friends, fictional characters, real life people, or historical leaders who we can actually load into our games. I assume they plan on releasing more leaders in the future, and I really hope that these are free. Like in Civ, you can set parameters on how you want your world to be generated. I bring this up because I did want to point out that, in my opinion, the default settings tended to result in way too many cliffs, and these cliffs, while very pretty, would make it a little bit difficult to traverse the world. So that's just something to consider when generating your worlds. Alright, so now onto the actual gameplay, and before I dive too deep, just a heads up, the game is constantly being updated, and I've seen that in beta versions they are testing some improvements to the game, so while I might have a lot of complaints, many of these might actually be fixed in the future or even by the time I actually post this video. Eras, cultures, and fame. So you and all other leaders start off the game in the Neolithic era with a small tribe of people. By finding and hunting for food, you begin to grow your population and discover the land around you. This is nice because it allows you to scout and compete for land before deciding where to settle. You can also claim land at this point, although you don't create any cities yet. In order to advance to the ancient era, you need to perform certain tasks which give you era stars. In the Neolithic era, this consists of hunting animals, growing your population, and discovering curiosities, which give you science and influence. I really like the whole Neolithic era and would honestly play a game that focuses entirely on surviving that age. Once you're ready to advance to the ancient era, you get to choose from 10 different cultures, each with their own permanent bonuses, unique units, and unique districts. Overall, there are 7 different cultural archetypes. I do think though that some archetypes in general seem to be stronger than others. I also just think in general there are some cultures which just seem way more powerful than others, and some balancing will definitely be needed to help those which are a bit more underwhelming. This can be especially true as some archetypes just aren't as good in different phases of the game that you might adopt them. I tried my best to play as many cultures as I could across the various campaigns, and some definitely just seemed way too good, and others are an absolute pain to face off against. I'm looking at you, Huns. For all ages after the Neolithic era, you can earn era stars through growing your population, constructing districts, adding territory to your lands, killing enemy units, researching technologies, earning money, and earning influence. I think these different methods can give you a nice balance of playstyles, but some just seem way easier to earn than others. Once you earn a minimum of 7 and up to 21 era stars, you can again then choose from another 10 cultures from the next age to adopt for your civilization. Choosing different cultures will change your empire aesthetically, and I think that watching this change occur is a treat, but I do wish that they had made the adoption of cultures more of an assimilation rather than a replacement. I like the culture system as a whole, but I do feel like the AI tends to rush to the next age as quickly as possible, and it often leaves you without many cultures to choose from, unless you rush yourself as well. If you desire, you can also keep your old culture, which gives you a fame boost. So now you're probably wondering, what the heck is fame? Fame is Humankind's key victory resource. You can get fame from earning era stars as well as from certain key accomplishments such as discovering natural wonders, constructing wonders, researching key technologies, and more. There are different game-ending conditions, and whichever civilization has the most fame when the game is ended wins the game. Overall, I do like the fame system as I think it gives players freedom to play how they want, whereas in Civ, many games do end up feeling a bit samey as you try to navigate to the same victory conditions. I do think the fame system could use some tweaking though, with how much fame you get from certain activities, and maybe just more ways of generating, or even taking away fame from other empires. I sort of feel like catching up in fame can be a bit difficult, especially if one nation begins to really snowball ahead. I'm also disappointed there's no great person system, as I feel like great people are one of the most prominent ways we remember history, and that would have been a natural addition to the fame mechanic. I also think maybe it would have been beneficial to give some bonus star rewards at the end of the game, almost in a style similar to Mario Party games. That way, it could help the game feel a bit more unpredictable as you reach the end. Developing your civilization. So once you hit the ancient era, you can then begin to establish your empire and claim territories. Unlike in Civ, in Humankind you control territories which are pre-mapped out. To do this, you need to spend influence in order to create an outpost, and later a city to claim the land as your own. You can then add adjacent claimed territories to your already established cities, or create more cities. What I like about the system is that you can claim as much land as your resources allow, but you also need to be able to protect these outposts or else enemies can come in and try to take these territories for themselves. I do have a minor complaint though that sometimes these pre-mapped territories can have some weird borders, and I think some logic to prevent your coast from being part of other territories would be helpful and more natural. Once you have a city, you can then begin to establish districts. There's a district for each resource type, with the main resources for each city following the FIMS system, which stands for food, industry, money, and science. These 4 resources are key to developing your cities and nation as a whole. Production in particular is super useful, as with enough production, you might actually be able to produce multiple things in a turn with production surpluses. There are also districts which can grant influence, faith, and stability, which are some of the other key resources which you need to develop your empire. I found the district system straightforward and simplistic to use, and I mean that in a good way. Establishing districts improves that resource yield, but also decreases your empire's stability, so you need to be wary of this, or else you might have to deal with some rebellions. Setting up districts next to each other will also grant adjacency bonuses, further increasing the amount of resources you might get. In addition to constructing districts, you're also able to build infrastructures and hold public ceremonies. Infrastructures are constructible in cities and give different bonuses to the city. The effects can vary quite a bit. These include straightforward resource boosts, as well as resource boosts for adjacencies and terrain. Infrastructures are key to exponentially increasing your resource yields. Public ceremonies, on the other hand, are repeatable improvements which increase yields in a city. They aren't placed on the map, but instead, upon completion, will grant a permanent boost to a city's resource yield. For me personally, I never really found much of a reason to build these, as there's plenty of other things to build. But hey, let me know if maybe these are actually secretly overpowered. Managing your citizens in a city is also super easy, and I like the system that they have here. You can easily click and drag citizens in your city and assign them to the resource you want. You can also set priorities, and I think this is overall a very nice, simple way of managing your cities. Another important part of the game is luxury resources. Luxury resources provide different unique effects, and these effects can actually be stacked if you have multiple copies or trade for multiple copies of a resource. This makes it so luxuries can actually have some pretty massive impact on your empire. Like any other 4X game, science is an incredibly important part of the game. Here you go through a fairly simple tech tree, and while I didn't have any major issues with the one in Humankind, I did find it weird that some technologies could be skipped entirely. I also found that the pacing of science could be a bit odd at times. This is especially the case because, again, the AI tends to speed through the ages, but this would often mean that technologically, civs would often be behind the times. Influence is one of the most important resources in the game, especially early on. Influence is used to establish outposts and create cities or attach outposts to your currently existing cities. Influence is also important because it can also be used to enact civics, which is Humankind's cultural pillar system. You have the option to select a civic and choose between 2 options which will grant different bonuses, which also affect your ideological standing. These ideologies will define your empire and what they value. These include collectivism versus individualism, liberty versus authority, tradition versus progress, and nationalism versus universalism. The more centrist you are, the more stable your empire will be, but also keep in mind that your placement on the ideological axes will impact your relationships with other nations, where those with similar views will be friendlier with you. I do like the civic system overall, and I like how it's a very long-term effect, but I do think that some choices seem way more useful than others. Influence is also important as your influence will passively spread and potentially pull other empires' territories into your sphere of influence. Those in the same sphere of influence will be friendlier with each other, but this can also trigger osmosis events, which might either grant you a science boost, or maybe force you to adopt certain civics to be more in line with the influential empire. Influence is also used to claim wonders. Once you bank enough influence, you're prompted that you can claim a world wonder. This allows you to reserve it so there's no risk of other empires building it before you. You then can begin construction of the wonder, which is a shared project, which means all cities in your empire can contribute to its construction. Once finished, wonders grant you fame, as well as other resources and abilities, many of which can be immensely powerful. Because of all these different uses for influence, I found influence to be perhaps the most important resource, at least in the early and mid-game. It then ends up becoming fairly useless later on in the game unless you want to reorganize your cities. Faith is another key resource in the game. Creating holy sites allows you to generate faith. You generate faith until you reach a new tier. At each of these tiers, you can establish a tenet for your religion, which can give you some useful bonuses, as well as allowing you to build more holy sites. Religion then spreads passively around the map through faith. Honestly though, I thought the religion system was pretty meh. The tenets can be really useful, sure, but other than that, there's not much you can actually do with regards to religion. There's even a later civic which seems to pretty much make your religion useless, which I found really strange. Like sure, I can understand it from the standpoint of separation of church and state, but religion is such an important part of human life that I think it didn't really make any sense. Religion is definitely an area I'd like to see them beef up in the game. Finally, here I want to talk about the event system. These events will force you to make certain choices which can have different results and effects on your nation. These choices will often also affect your ideology. I do like the event system, but I do think it could have more events and an overall greater impact. Especially late in the game, the cost of choosing some choices is so minuscule that there really is no reason why you wouldn't choose the good option over others. I also feel like I have no idea how these events would be triggered, and I wish that they had more concrete events that would cause them to occur. Diplomacy and war. So before I dive into diplomacy with other empires, I want to start with independent peoples. Similar to city-states which pop up in Civ games, Humankind has their own take on it with independent peoples. These groups will spawn in unclaimed territories and establish their own cities. Like with other empires, you can have skirmishes and issues with these independent peoples. However, with enough time and maybe some money or influence, you can develop relationships with them, allowing for trade, mercenaries, and even allowing the option to assimilate them into your lands. These independent peoples will decline over time too, if not assimilated, and will eventually disappear from the map. Honestly, I do like the system overall, but it can definitely be a bit annoying having to deal with them sometimes, especially as they might terrorize your lands. Alright, so now on to diplomacy with other major empires. Overall, I actually do really like how Humankind handles diplomatic relationships, but I do think there are some tweaks that would help make the system feel a lot better. They give you a number of different treaties which you can enact with an empire which might allow for trade, open borders, and even sharing maps. The system is really easy to use, but I do wish they allowed for more trade options. In Humankind, instead of negotiating to exchange resources for a certain amount of time, you instead purchase access to resources, which means you pay a fee, and boom, you have it. The problem is you don't even get to choose a price, and rather the price is based on distance and mode of transportation. Then you have access to the resource indefinitely until you cancel your treaty, or until violence halts your trade. The problem is, they only give you 3 different trade treaty options. Either don't trade at all, allow a trade of luxuries only, or allow trade of everything including strategic resources. I don't necessarily love that, as maybe I just want to trade for some oil and not leave my uranium open for others to create nukes. This can be especially problematic as strategic resource deposits can be a bit scarce, so a lot of the time, your biggest competition will be the ones who you need to trade to get key resources. I would have liked some more granularity or the ability to refuse trade of certain resources. On the other hand, I think Humankind has a really smart grievance system. When empires inflict grievances on each other, such as trespassing, attacking each other's troops, and more, it allows you to make demands for reparations for gold or territory. Making demands can stack up, and if the other nation doesn't comply with your demands, you'll also gain war support from your people. You can think of war support as an overall war health bar. Once you reach a certain threshold of war support, you're then able to declare war. During war, your support will go up and down based on the results of battles until one nation loses their war support and is forced to surrender. I actually think it's a really cool system, but I do think it needs some tweaking as well. For one thing, it can be a bit easy to cheese, as the amount of increase and decrease is flat, which means you can trigger surrenders easily by taking fights with single units. I think maybe making war support changes based on the number of units lost or something similar might be a better system. Another thing that can be slightly annoying is the forced surrender system. I actually do like it as a mechanic, but I think forcing surrender should be at the discretion of the war winner. Forced surrender can cause some issues, as sometimes you might find yourself about to take an enemy city, but then boom, suddenly you're forced to accept the enemy's surrender. This can be remedied with the surrender conditions, which again is a system I like, but I do think it could use some tweaks. Here you're able to demand reparations of gold and land based on your war score. My main issue here is that the land is named based on territories, but they don't make it super clear and easy to recognize which territories are which. I saw that they were testing a better screen in the beta, so I'm glad that they're receptive and improving the game. I also ran into some issues where I couldn't demand territories that were clearly adjacent to my land, and it wasn't always clear why. As part of the surrender demands, you can also take another empire as your vassal. The vassal then provides tribute in the form of money per turn. As the liege, you can control the treaties and demands, as well as any resources of the vassal. Again, here, I think it's a really great system, but I do wish that they gave diplomatic options to try and convince a vassal to rebel against their liege. There were quite a few times where I was hesitant to go to war because of vassalage, and I would have liked the option to go to a vassal and say that I'd help them earn their freedom so I could take their liege down a peg. So with all this talk of war, I think it's about time that I talk about the combat in the game, and honestly, the combat of Humankind is probably one of the best parts. First, let me start with the garrison system. Cities are able to create garrisons, which are a district which grants stability. Garrisons also give a spawning point for units created in the city. Additionally, they grant vision and a defensive tile for your army. I really like the system as it allows for quick and flexible reinforcements. I really like the actual combat as well. Unlike in Civ where units take up one tile and play more like chess pieces, here you can stack multiple units to form regiments. Then, when you bring troops in for a fight, you go through a mini battle where you can actually control the units in your regiment over the actual terrain of the map. As an attacker, your job is to take the enemy flag, while defenders need to prevent the enemy from doing this. The combat system can actually be fairly difficult, as I found the terrain can be a pretty huge difference in how battles play out. Even with more or stronger units, poor positioning and decision making can make it easy for fights to swing. This can be particularly true as I do feel like terrain isn't super easy to understand, and this is true both in and outside of combat. Because of the levels of elevation of the land, and in my opinion how weirdly they decided to make rivers work in the game, movement to me can feel a bit unintuitive. If you're not really zoomed in enough, you might miss things and find that your units can't move to or attack areas that you thought. I do really like the elevation in the game, but pathing can be weird as a result. And again, I really do think the decision to make rivers a tile instead of in between tiles was a bit of a strange one and just doesn't make sense to me when I try to imagine how the units are actually moving. Maybe the river is supposed to be the whole tile, but that isn't very clear visually. Even so, controlling these battles is super fun and just adds to the strategy in the game. They also allow you to auto battle. You can place your units on the battlefield and then let the armies battle it out like an auto chess game. I also really like the reinforcement system where having other regiments nearby can allow you to reinforce your army, and these are not only super useful, but can also be really surprising if you don't have vision over reinforcements. Even though it might hurt me, I do like being surprised and finding out that I misevaluated a fight. I do have some small recommendations though for improvements with combat. For one thing, I think taking cities early in the game seems a bit too easy. This is remedied later on with civilians and walls, but I think that taking cities should feel more difficult overall, as I've had times where you kind of just walk into a city with no resistance. It's also a bit weird that ships can't attack cities, which historically is a pretty major part of combat. Additionally, I think they should make some tweaks to the minimum damage values. As an attacker, there's a minimum amount of damage units will do to each other, regardless of their strength or era, so this can result in situations where maybe an army of swordsmen can take out a tank. I also wish I could choose the direction my units retreat in, if I choose to disengage from a battle, or at the very least, I wish the retreating was a bit smarter. Sometimes units will retreat in some pretty weird directions rather than towards one of my own cities or garrisons. One other thing to note is that all nations take their turns at the same time. That means whenever you move a unit, others will move them simultaneously. I do actually like this because it makes turns feel seamless and it helps to nail down the one more turn feeling of 4X games, but you do run into issues where sometimes you'll end up as a defender in some fights where you really meant to be the engager. Nitpicks. Okay, so here I wanted to discuss some nitpicks I had which didn't really fit into any other sections. 1. I wish notifications and tooltips would give a little bit more information. Sometimes it just tells you something triggered or something happened without actually really giving you details or an easy way to identify what might have changed. The lack of useful tooltips also just makes understanding the game a bit harder than it really needed to be. In general, I also just think learning the game could be made a lot easier, as I myself even resorted to looking up videos and wiki pages. I also find it a bit tough to follow the changing of other empires' cultures. They name each empire based on the current culture, so the name of the empire is constantly changing, and it's just not that easy to follow who is who all the time. Finally, I found it annoying that you can't downgrade cities or areas to territories. You lose influence if you go over the city cap limit, so you end up getting penalized pretty heavily for taking enemy cities or assimilating independent peoples with no real way to fix the situation other than maybe waiting for a really long time or maybe raising one of your own cities. So of course I gotta talk about some of the other technical aspects of the game. With regards to the graphics, I think the game looks amazing and is absolutely gorgeous. I love the verticality of the game and the different levels of elevation, and overall I think it's the best looking historical 4X game on the market. There's also just so much great attention to detail, and you can tell that they put a lot of love into the little things. My main issue with the visuals is around the UI though. I feel like the UI just feels a bit crowded at times. You need to make an effort to click out of a bunch of things. And yet, despite there being so much screen space committed to the UI, I still had issues figuring out where to find certain information. I also found some UI elements which would block certain other things, like the trade route marker blocking my potential outposts. I'm also just not a huge fan of how when you zoom out, it gives you this bland gray map, and then when you go further, it gives you these ugly colored blobs to signify your country. I think I would have preferred zooming out and still seeing the world and terrain as is, and maybe giving us different filters so we can identify cities, territories, religion, influence, and whatever else we might want to see. I really feel like the whole zoom out ruins what is otherwise a really beautiful map. With regards to the audio, I thought the music was really great. It's definitely at least comparable to Civ's soundtrack, but whether or not it's better, I don't think I can really say. I love how there's a bunch of different themes for different cultures, and I also like how the music switches between music and ambiance. The announcer for the game also isn't bad and is a bit cheeky with his humor, but I did feel like some of the stuff he'd say just felt a bit too long. I can see some people not loving the announcer though, and maybe would have preferred a more serious one. It can also be slightly annoying when he sometimes repeats the same lines over and over again.
You have reached the end of an ideology axis.
One thing I really did like about the announcer was the end of game announcement where they run through your achievements and the type of empire you ran, but I also found it slightly weird that at the end screen when they calculate your score, there isn't any sort of sound effects as they tally up the points. It made the end game screen feel less satisfying than it really should have been. Overall though, while I know I sound super critical of Humankind, I'm only critical because I do think Humankind has great potential. For the initial release in the series, I think it's super polished and has a lot of great unique takes on Civ-style gameplay. I just think there are some areas that they could definitely improve and balance more properly. While I do think the game is actually worth the $50 price tag, the main issue I run into is that I'm not sure I can recommend the game over Civ 6 at the moment. I think if you want a change of pace from Civ, then yeah, Humankind is a good game to try out, although I do think you should be prepared for the ride as they release more patches and future expansions or DLC. I will say though that Humankind does deliver a bit of a different experience. Whereas Civ feels more like a grand board game, Humankind feels much more like a sandbox. If I had to give the game a rating, I think I'd have to give it a 3 out of 4. I definitely enjoyed my time playing the game, and it will continue to be a game I revisit, but again, I do think it'll take some time before it becomes a truly great game. But hey, that's just me. Feel free to let me know down below what you think. Have you tried Humankind, and what'd you think of it? And if you made it this far, truly, I really do appreciate you checking out the video. I know this one was a bit of a doozy. If you enjoyed it, please consider hitting that like or subscribe button as it really helps my channel and motivates me to make more and better videos. And of course, as usual, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Peace.